Alrighty, chat, let's get started. Welcome to another HealthyGamerGG stream. My name is Dr. Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. So welcome y'all to the last stream of the year. So this is our last Healthy Gamer stream that is official anyway. Sometimes I show up and randomly I'll stream video games and stuff if I'm taking a break over the holidays, but this is our last stream of the year. So we really have been grateful to all of your participation through all of 2023. We hope that we've been able to help y'all, support y'all. Hopefully y'all learned a lot. Hopefully y'all had some fun during the process. Yeah, so thank y'all very much. So today we're going to be talking about asexuality. So we're going to do a deep dive into asexuality. So what does that mean? So we're going to sort of take this concept of asexuality and I'm going to kind of give y'all my take on it. So it's not just like my opinion. So we're going to talk about a lot of science, a lot of clinical medicine, a lot of neuroscience, psychology, even a little bit of like culture and history so that we can understand like this concept of asexuality. Another thing, before we dive into that, we just want to say that we really appreciate everybody's feedback about the commercialization of Healthy Gamer. If this has been a concern for y'all, we strongly recommend you check out, we did like basically a 2-hour stream with me and Kruti where we explained our perspective on like how we think about money and HG. So y'all can check that out. I think there's a VOD of it. I don't know if it's still living on Twitch or if it's on YouTube or what platform it's living on now, because Twitch VODs tend to get deleted. But if that's something that y'all are super curious about, we absolutely incorporate all of your feedback. We really pay attention to it. And one of the big things that we had sort of heard from people is that, we don't do like deep dive kind of content anymore. And so this is in line with that. Just so y'all understand, deep dive content takes like a long time to do. So it was easier for me to make this stuff at the beginning when I already had like a bank of stuff in my head. So there are a lot of things that I was sort of like not an expert in, but things that I felt very comfortable teaching for a couple of hours about. And as we're sort of developing like exploration of newer topics, things that I have less clinical experience in, it takes a little bit more time to prepare. So the deep dive that we're going to be talking about today probably took somewhere between 20 and 30 hours of like preparation to put together. So we really appreciate everybody's feedback. We're going to try to give everybody what they want. The challenge is that different people want different things. So we're going to do our best to accommodate. And yeah, so happy holidays, everybody. And let's dive in. Not running out of content. There's tons of content to make. It's just, we're like ranking up, right? So as we start to get into different stuff, it becomes a little bit, it just requires more work. So I'm not like an expert in asexuality, so that requires more work. Okay, so today we are going to talk about, is chat work, not work? Let's see. There we go. Let's see if chat works. All right, there we go. All right. So today we're going to be talking about asexuality. And my hope today is to give y'all a perspective of asexuality that will do a couple of different things. First of all, understand like the history of asexuality. And then we're going to understand a little bit about the epidemiology of asexuality. Then we're going to dive into sort of a neuroscience perspective on sexuality. So how do we feel like when we're like sexual creatures, what's going on in our brain? And once we understand the core neuroscience behind asexuality, we can start to get into what I would call kind of the differential diagnosis of not feeling sexual. And what we'll discover is that if you don't feel sexual, there's many potential reasons for that. And those include things like probably a normal sexual variant, right? That is not pathologic anyway. It's not an illness or anything like that. And then there are also pathologies. So these are things that are basically like wrong with us. Some kind of diagnosable thing whether it be a hormone imbalance or something like that. That lead to a lack of sexual desire. And then we also, once we kind of get through some of that, we're going to sort of dive into features of asexuality. And then what we're going to do is explore a little bit more about sort of the pathologies of asexuality. And then we may sort of end off a little bit. I may stick this stuff a little bit earlier, maybe even somewhere around here, but talking a little bit about alexithymia. And then at the end, we're going to talk about alexithymia and autism spectrum specifically, and its connection and potentially schizoid personality types and asexuality. Okay? So the goal here is I'm sort of envisioning a couple of different audiences. The first is like if you're a parent of a child who says, hey, mom, dad, I'm asexual. Like, how do you understand that? How should you approach that? On the flip side, if you're someone who's been wondering whether you're asexual, my hope is to educate you a little bit on all of this stuff, right? So what does it mean to be asexual? What are the different causes? What's going on in the brain? Are you ill? Are you not ill? Is it a normal variant? To help y'all get through that. And then especially this piece may be kind of interesting because we know a fair amount about the features of asexuality. So like what happens, there's a lot of details that we'll kind of get into that will hopefully be subjectively relatable for y'all. So what that sort of means is like, I don't know if I'm asexual or not. So what are some of the features of people who are asexual? So for example, people who are asexual are much more likely to be attracted to and fantasize about fictional characters. Right? It's just something like that's a little bit unusual. We'll get to why that is. There's a really fascinating thing. So if you're the kind of person who's like, man, I watch a bunch of anime and like I'm not interested in anyone in my real life, but man, I'm totally in love with this anime character. That's actually consistent with asexuality, a feature of asexuality. Okay. So we'll get to that. I know. So that's why like a lot of stuff in my hope with all of these lectures is to educate y'all. And then once we sort of educate you, we'll sort of get a little bit into what next steps may be for like, but just learn a little bit about yourself. Okay. I know calling us out. It's chill. Okay. Now, hopefully we're going to cover this in about 2 hours. Okay. But maybe it'll be a little bit faster, maybe a little bit shorter. So let's start off with the history of asexuality. All right. So this is where things get kind of interesting. Okay. I'm going to just go back to this for a second. So let's just talk about the history of asexuality. It's okay. All right. So first thing is that the term asexuality has nothing to do with human sexual behavior when it was first coined. Asexuality was originally designed as a term to describe microorganisms. So there are different kinds of bacteria, and like some of them will like reproduce without sexual contact with like another bacteria. So if y'all studied like, cell biology and sort of microbiology, you'll remember that there's some kinds of bacteria that will have things called F plasmids. So this is like this DNA transfer that one bacteria does to another bacteria. And then like the F plasmid has all this machinery that allows you to transfer material from one bacteria to another. The interesting thing is that once you transfer the F plasmid, then the second bacteria will have the ability to transfer it to something else, to a different bacteria. So originally, asexuality had nothing to do with human beings. It was just all about sort of understanding microbiology. And then if we sort of look at it, though, there's actually a fair amount of evidence that asexuality exists in the animal kingdom. And this is when we're now talking about a sexual variant. So, for example, some studies show that 12.5% of rams are asexual. So these are male rams, right? So a variant of a goat or a sheep or something. I don't know what a ram and a ewe. I know the positive and the, I don't know what the species is. They seem to have like no interest in sexual activity. So what biologists did, and these are fascinating papers to read, by the way. So just to tell you all like an interesting story. So there's some really old papers on biology of animal sexuality that are just stunning to believe. So one of my favorites was, they were also looking at rams. For some reason, biologists really like to study rams and their sexual behavior. Who knows why? But there were a group of biologists who were describing sexual behavior of rams. And what they noticed is that there are some rams who like engaging in sex with other rams. So these are both males, right? So they both have big horns, but one of them mounts the one male ram, they're all male if we use the word ram, mounts another ram. And then the biologists are looking at this and they're hypothesizing. They're trying to figure out what's going on here. And they're like, oh, we know what's going on. This is like back in the 50s or 60s. They're like, oh, like this ram is confused, right? So the ram who's doing the mounting doesn't understand that he's mounting another male, that he's actually like, he thinks it's a female. And then all the biologists are like, that's it, right? The ram is just confused. He doesn't know what he's doing. I don't know how it got in there. And then someone asked the question, they're like, okay, but what about the ram who's being mounted, right? What about the bottom, as it were? What's going on with that ram? And then they were like, I don't know, maybe he's confused too. So some of these early like biological explorations of sexuality are absolute a delight to read. So when we were looking at the behavior of animals, we've sort of discovered that in some populations, we'll sort of study populations, and up to 12.5% of rams are asexual, which means that they just seem to have no interest in engaging in sexual activity. So then we also know from like the history of humanity that it seems like asexuality in some form has been present in humanity and very well documented for like hundreds, if not thousands of years. So good examples of this are, there's like, there are these concepts of like, lifelong bachelors or spinsters, or even people who will like join religious organizations and are celibate. So like if you look at like the sort of the dialogue of religious organizations and how they view celibacy, they'll sort of say like celibacy is like a struggle, right? Like, oh my God, like you have all these sexual desires and you have to like conquer your sexual desires to be closer to God. But if you look at a lot of like the writings about a lot of these like monks and stuff, it didn't seem like they ever struggled. They just weren't very sexual to begin with, and they were like totally fine with that. So if you look at the history of humanity, we absolutely have like a subset of the human population that from basically as long as we have recorded history has not been very interested in sexual activity. Now, we don't know precisely how horny they were, right? But it seems like the more that you kind of look into it, there's clearly been a subset of the population that has not been engaging in sexual behavior. Now, we'll call that celibacy, which is the voluntary abstinence of sexual behavior. But if you really like look at some of these writings and stuff like that, it seems like the voluntary part wasn't very hard for many people. So many of these like monks and stuff just weren't too interested in sex to begin with, never really interested in them. They were just like, yeah, it's just not something I'm interested in. So it seems like asexuality has been, originally a biological term, but there seems to be evidence of something of a normal variant. We're not sure if it's normal or not. It could be pathological, right? But we sort of know that it's been around for a long time. So that's kind of a quick rundown of the history. Now let's talk a little bit about, the epidemiology. Okay? So key takeaways, 12.5% of Rams are asexual based on one study, right? So there seems to be history of low sex drive human beings. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by asexuality now, actually. Okay? Monks. Lifelong bachelor. Spinster. Right, so those are like kind of gendered terms. But now let's talk a little bit about, okay, what do we mean by asexuality? So if we're talking about asexuality, what we generally mean is a lack of sexual attraction. Or interest. So these are basically people who are not interested in sex or interested in sexual stuff. They're like, they don't get turned on kind of psychologically, okay? There's some really interesting studies. We'll get to this in more detail, but there's studies that show that physiologic responses for people who are asexual can be actually quite normal. So there's one study, for example, that had women watch erotic films. And what they did is sort of measure the level of like arousal based on the erotic film. And what they found is that these women who were asexual didn't have any sort of mental arousal. But if you do photoplethysmography of the vagina, so this is like measuring the physiologic response in the vagina, what you found is that there's a normal vaginal response. So the body seems to be responding appropriately to the erotic film, or what we would expect from normal people, but it really seems to be a lack of attraction or interest. So it's not quite physiological in nature. It seems to be a little bit more mental in nature. And even if we look at other variants of sexuality, most of the way that we define a sexuality is like what turns you on. Right? So if you get turned on by the opposite gender, we call you heterosexual. If you get turned on by the same gender, we call you homosexual. If you get turned on by both genders or all genders, we call you bisexual, pansexual, whatever. What turns you on? Okay? And even as a psychiatrist, like, when I'm assessing people's sexuality, this is kind of the route that I'll go, right? So like, I don't ask that question because that sounds weird, right? So I won't say like, oh, what turns you on? Like, I won't say that to a patient, but I will ask them, like when you fantasize or when you masturbate, like what kinds of things do you think about? So what are the things that you find sexually arousing? So those kinds of questions we can ask just to help people figure out what their sexuality is. Now, so let's talk a little bit about like how common this is. So about 1 to 3% of the population is probably asexual. This is based on various studies. Now we got to talk for a second about epidemiology and studies for a second. So we suspect that somewhere around 1 to 3% of people are asexual, okay? Now the first thing that we've got to understand about research around asexuality, so let's talk about research. is that the research on asexuality sucks. Bluntly. We've done very, very little research. The majority of papers on asexuality are published in 4 journals. So it's not like a widely studied topic. And then also, like, there's a ton of research that is like basically scanning the internet. So a lot of these studies on asexuality are not like actually laboratory studies, or not even things where you're talking to human beings or even surveying human beings. A lot of the research on asexuality comes from researchers scanning discussions on the internet and like pulling out themes and stuff of how asexual people feel. I know we were joking about being a weeb earlier, but I suspect this is how we kind of got there, right? Because our source of information is not, we're not doing some kind of objective research where we're sitting down and asking someone a ton of questions about what turns them on or measuring things or anything like that. We're just scanning parts of the internet and then we're sort of like synthesizing that into research. So our research is actually quite low quality. This is also because of problems like when we do these big studies. So we have some very large studies that we kind of do where we measure all kinds of crap, right? So these are like the study of adult human development, which is the longest running study that's run at Harvard, run by this guy named Bob Waldinger. Fantastic dude, was once a mentor of mine. And so in all these standardized studies, like, we ask all kinds of things, but we don't usually ask people if they're asexual. So this is starting to change now with the way that we sort of ask people how they identify. But the problem is that our research infrastructure has not been sort of geared to pick up or measure asexuality. And furthermore, a lot of our research on when we actually do talk to people is like very small sample size and things like that. Okay. So 1 to 3%. And it seems like the key feature is a lack of sexual attraction or interest. Okay. A couple of other things to understand about asexuality is that it doesn't seem to be clearly associated with depression and anxiety. So for some time, people were wondering, okay, what is asexuality? Is it basically like, we used to think it was a pathology, right? So then people thought, okay, like, if it's a pathology, it must be correlated with depression or anxiety. And then there's some studies that show correlations, other studies that don't show correlations. So I'm going to go ahead and say that there's not a clear link to depression or anxiety. And even so, the links to depression seem to be more associated with the social stigma of asexuality. So there's one study, for example, where we asked normal people, everybody, what do you think about people who have these various sexual natures? So like, what do you think about homosexuals, heterosexuals, whatever? And the interesting thing in that study is that people felt that asexual human beings were the least human. So like, this is the kind of thing, if we're talking about, okay, like, even gay people or bi people or lesbians or whatever, they're at least like horny and it turns them on, and they're filled with lust for a particular thing. Just the object of the lust is different. So if you kind of ask the average person what makes people, the most alien, it's having asexuality. So people have a lot of difficulty understanding the asexuality of other human beings, because at least you can relate to someone. If you're heterosexual or homosexual, you can understand that, okay, like, I get horny because of this, you get horny because of this, but at least we both, like, the horniness is there. That's a core feature of being a human being. So when you take away the horniness, when you take away the lust, it makes people like really, really hard, like they sort of don't understand that at all. We'll get more about social stigma later. Okay. So as we're sort of like looking at this kind of stuff, researchers basically sat down and started to think a little bit about, okay, like, what are the causes of asexuality? So if someone does not have sexual desire, if there is a lack of interest, what are the potential causes of that? And this is where there's all kinds of stuff that is associated with low sexual interest. So now we're going to run through a quick differential diagnosis. I don't think this is going to take 2 hours. I think we're going to blow through it. Man, I prepped really well. So the first is that is a normal variant. Okay? So this is like, some people are just asexual, like the Rams. Okay? But then we also know there's all kinds of pathologies that relate to low sexual interest. So one is HSIDD, which is hyposexual interest desire disorder. Okay. And there's actually a female variant and a male variant that are a little bit different. We'll talk a little bit more about this if y'all want to. But the big thing that separates hyposexual interest desire disorder is that in the case of an asexual person or someone who has HSIDD, they both lack the interest to have sex. They both lack the ability to be aroused and things like that. There's a huge difference. These people are okay with it, and these people are distressed by it. So if you find yourself to be worried and be like, I don't want to lack arousal. I don't like this. I want to be more aroused. So if you look at studies, for example, people with HSIDD are more likely to have romantic partners. So they're more likely to be in relationships, right? And so it causes problems in the relationship, and the person themselves is unhappy. So this is the big difference. If you're okay with your lack of sexual interest, it's more likely that you're asexual. If you are not okay with your lack of sexual interest, then you're more likely to be down this road. And even one of the exclusion criteria of HSIDD is hyposexual interest desire disorder, is being asexual. So if you're asexual, you can't be diagnosed with HSIDD, or, I mean, there's some nuance there, but that's like one of the key things to understand. Okay? So even before we get to the rest of the stuff, we'll get to the rest of the stuff, but like, this is a big difference. So does it bother you or does it not bother you? If it doesn't bother you, then you're asexual. It's probably a normal variant. We'll get to that in a second. So there are also other things that like kind of may make you lack interest in sexual activity. Another one is celibacy, right? So this is a case where it's not that you lack interest, but that you are voluntarily trying to sublimate or reduce your interest. You're just choosing not to engage in sexual activity, and hopefully over time you stop being sexually aroused. Okay? But then there are also other kinds of causes for a lack of sexual interest. So some people hypothesize that, the reason that people are asexual is because they've been traumatized. And trauma is on the differential for someone who is not interested in sexuality. But this also looks a little bit different. This usually has to do with fear of intimacy, or this has to do with like adverse physiologic reactions. Right? So like, for example, if I have a history of like sexual trauma, then when I start to engage in a sexual act or I start to feel aroused, my body will also activate danger signals because my body has sort of figured out that things go together, right? So neurons that fire together wire together. So this is why like Pavlov sort of discovered this with his dogs, where he rang the bell and then he fed the dogs food. And so the neurons that detect the bell fire around the same time that the dog gets fed. So these two neurons then start activating together, and all Pavlov had to do is ring the bell to cause his dogs to salivate. In the same way, we can develop traumatic responses. This is what we can call triggers. Okay? And so these triggers can be pretty specific to the person in the experience. So like anytime I get sexually aroused, I can start to also feel panic. So let's say I was sexually abused by one of my parents. And so any kind of sexual touch also comes with some kind of pain. And so my brain associates these two things together. And so like this causes problems. So there can be other kinds of trauma. It doesn't have to be sexual trauma. So you can just fear intimacy in general and connection with another person and being vulnerable. We'll get to a little bit of that when we get into the neuroscience. But there is absolutely a variant of a lack of sexual interest, which probably has something to do with trauma. Then we also know that there are hormonal changes that correlate with a lack of sexual interest. So low testosterone, in both men and women, by the way. We also know that high levels of prolactin, also in both men and women, are associated with decreases in sexual arousal. So we know that there's like all kinds of different stuff, hormonal imbalances, even like thyroid changes and stuff like that can correlate with like a lack of sexual interest. So the first takeaway for y'all is if you feel a lack of sexual interest, it may not be that you are asexual. It may be that one of these things is going on too. Well, this one you probably know because you figured that part out. So this is why, like, I wouldn't jump to a conclusion, and that's kind of the point of this, is for y'all to understand that there's like a variety of different things going on, and we're going to talk through them a little bit, okay? But one of the key things that basically happened in the research on asexuality is that as we looked at these things, what essentially happened is people discovered that if you take all of this stuff, this does not explain or account for all lack of sexual desire. So what basically they did is they took people who were asexual, didn't have any sexual interest, and they assessed them for each of these things. And what they sort of found is, oh, actually like 1 to 3% of the population has none of this stuff going on. So it may just be a normal sexual variant, right? And then they looked at like research on rams and whatnot, and they saw, okay, this happens in the animal kingdom too. All right. So this is kind of a quick differential of like how to think about sort of feeling asexual or having a lack of interest in sexuality. So now that we sort of know, okay, it appears that 1 to 3% of people is not a voluntary choice and do not have anything physiologically wrong with them as far as we know, that means that there is a variant that is asexual. So let's talk about features of asexuality. Okay, so what do we know about people who are asexual? And this is where things get interesting. And we'll get to the neuroscience inside. Actually, let me think for a second. Okay, before we get to this, I'm going to change the order of something. Okay. First, what we're going to talk about is normal sexuality neuroscience. Okay? So the next thing that we have to do before we sort of understand asexuality is we have to understand what is the default functioning of like sexuality in a human being. So where does sexuality come from? Like what parts of the brain are involved? How do these different things work? And I'd love to kind of just walk y'all through some of this stuff, okay? So like hopefully this like helps y'all understand, just even if you're not asexual, like if I get aroused and I lust for someone, I like sex, whatever, like how does that process work? What is the process of sexual arousal and engagement in human beings, okay? So the first thing that we're going to start with is the thalamus. So the thalamus is the gateway to the brain. And what does that mean? That means that we have the sense organs, and they feed their input into the thalamus, right? So it starts with sensory input. Okay? So I see something that I may find arousing. Now, the next thing that happens is that once we have the thalamus, we also have our limbic system and amygdala. And so the thalamus sort of synthesizes this sexual input, and then starts thinking about sex. Okay? Like, oh, like this person is naked and is strutting in front of me and like is talking in an accent and is like, you know, like going like this, like, oh my God, like now we're talking and they're dancing and oh my God, this is great. So it starts with sensory input. Now, as I give you guys this sensory input, okay, so like we'll just give you all an example. So like Dr. K can go like this. I can go, oh, I got to move this over here. Hold on. I can go like, oh yeah, come on, let's talk. Let's go, baby. So now y'all are getting sensory input, right? But are you aroused? Oh yeah, let's go. No, you're not aroused. Come on. Don't be ridiculous. So if we understand, like, if what you're doing right now is you're like probably laughing, right? Because this is hilarious. I'm not actually like, I'm not horny. No, you guys, with the way the Twitch meta is nowadays. Okay. So if you really look at it, what's happening? Like, even though I'm doing these kinds of things, right? So what's happening is you're actually getting an emotional modulation of the sensory input. So you get an emotional modulation. So now emotions enter the picture, okay? And this is governed by the limbic system and the amygdala, okay? So then what happens is once we modulate the input, right? So we have an emotional reaction to it. That'll make us more aroused or less aroused. So once we become aroused, Then it triggers other kinds of things. So then this arousal goes to the hypothalamus. And now we're engaging the physiology. So now our body starts to respond, right? So it starts with sensory input plus emotions, and then my body begins to respond. So maybe I'll get erect. I'll start to get piloerection. This means our hair stands up on end. I may start to get sweaty. We have this autonomic nervous system kind of response, which is also really interesting because the response in the autonomic nervous system, it's one of the few things that both engages the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So we engage both kind of at the same time. Some parts become are activated by the parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll just give you all a quick example of this. So if we look at penile erection. So the erection itself is caused by the parasympathetic nervous system. So when we're relaxed, if we're dudes, we are likely to get boners. So this is something to understand. It doesn't mean that you're aroused. Arousal is not the only thing that causes an erection. Relaxation can cause an erection. This is why you wake up in the morning with things like morning wood. But then what happens is the process of ejaculation is governed by the sympathetic nervous system. So basically, our body gets primed by our parasympathetic nervous system. So we kind of get into this like relaxed, chilling, kind of vibing state. And then we launch into sympathetic nervous system activity as we engage in the sexual act. This is all coordinated by the hypothalamus, okay? Then there's a couple of other regions of the brain that are like really, really important. So the first is that depending on what happens after the arousal, based on the act, we will activate our nucleus accumbens, which is our reward center of the brain. Right? So if I engage in some kind of sexual act and I have an orgasm, then I get a spurt of dopamine, and then I'm reinforcing the behavior. So then what happens is the nucleus accumbens shapes our reward. So then what happens is if we engage in the sexual act, this is going to feed back and go to the thalamus and tell it, hey, seeing these things is a sign that good things are coming. This is great. We love what we're seeing right here. And it also goes back to the limbic system in the amygdala. And it's saying, hey, get excited, baby, because this stuff is great. Right? So it kind of feeds back. Now, this is also, well, we'll get to problems in a second, all right? So then there are a couple of other things to keep in mind. One is that the frontal lobes, generally speaking, have an inhibitory effect on this whole process. So the more our frontal lobes are active, the less sexual we don't want to engage in sexual behavior. Our restraint towards sexuality comes from our frontal lobes, okay? There are a couple of other things, like we've got regions like the septal region, insula, that all are involved as well. So the insula, for example, is physiologic feedback. So this is just a bit complicated, but I'll just give you all an example of something that we're not covering. So as we start to get this kind of stuff, then the erect penis then sends signals back to the brain. How do you know you're erect, right? How do you know? You don't have to look at it. You can tell physiologically. So these signals then go back to the insula, and then the insula lets the rest of your brain know, hey, we're good to go. All right? So the septal region is just a part that modulates our sexual drive based on all kinds of different stuff. So there's like different kinds of stuff that basically will go and modify, will modify this, either by strengthening it or weakening it, okay? So this is a rough idea of like how we have sex. So there's other parts of the brain that are really important. So we're just going to talk about our empathic circuits of the brain. Okay? And this kind of relates to like the limbic system. I'm going to just sort of take a circuit approach as opposed to an anatomical approach. But basically, like what the empathy that we receive, how connected we are with our potential partner will lead to pluses or minuses. Okay? So like if we're vibing, like I'm into you and you're into me, like, oh my God, like that's going to reinforce things, right? Whereas if I'm into sex and you're not into sex, like there's no empathy, there's no connection there. So I can still feel lust, but the experience is going to be a little bit different. So for those of y'all that have had sexual relationships where like you're into it and the partner isn't, they can still have sex with you because, you know, y'all are in a committed relationship and you don't feel like it all the time. They don't feel like it all the time. Maybe you don't feel like it, but they feel like it. So you kind of do your duty, right? So this is an example of like why it's different. Whereas like when I'm super into it and you're super into it, the sexual act is a lot more intense. And why is that? It's because the empathic circuits of the brain are also giving us pluses. So the more pluses we get, okay, the more intense the sexual act will be. So this is a quick rundown of the neuroscience of sex. So now what happens is let's talk a little bit about what's different about people who are asexual. Okay? Actually, I'm going to pause for a second. Let's just... do y'all have any questions? Okay. I will do that. Thanks, Tech Teller. Pause, champ. I will check. Okay, so we're going to do this and we're going to disable chat. Okay, we have to disable chat. Sorry, chat. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. Let's ask questions. What if I think I'm asexual, but I'm not? We're going to get to that. Good. This is all good. Does this apply to female sexuality too? Absolutely. Okay, my wife is asexual. Okay, this is good. This is good. This is good. Does love have any effect on it? Of course love has an effect on it. We'll get to that. We'll get to like aromantic and romantic and all that kind of stuff in a second. But so hopefully y'all understand. So someone's asking, does love have an effect? Yes, that's what we pointed out, right? So that's why we're talking about amygdala, limbic circuit system, and empathy. So not just love has an effect, this is how it has an effect. And this is kind of what I'm pointing out to y'all. Hopefully y'all are going to see this. But this is kind of like a spoiler, okay? So if we look at the act of sex and the arousal of sex. So remember, first of all, that asexuality is a feature of arousal, okay? It's not necessarily a feature of behavior or anything like that. So now what we can see is that as we start to knock out various of these things, so let's say that I'm not in love. This is going to affect my sexual arousal. Let's say that I have difficulty with empathy. This is going to affect my sexual arousal. Let's say that I watched porn a lot and that has fucked up my nucleus accumbens. That will affect my sexual arousal. Let's say that I'm used to masturbating in a particular way, either with a vibrator or death grip or something like that. That is going to affect my insula and the feedback that I get from my sexual organs that go to my brain and drive me towards different kinds of sexual pleasure or lack of pleasure. If we look at things like if my autonomic nervous system is out of whack, let's say I'm super stressed out. And since I'm stressed out, my sympathetic nervous system is highly, highly active, right? This is what happens when I get stressed. My heart rate is high, my blood pressure is high. And so then what happens is even though sympathetic nervous system is involved in ejaculation, the parasympathetic nervous system can never prime us for the sexual act. So stress acts here. The last thing is that if my frontal lobes are highly active, so if I'm like trying to restrain myself, let's say I'm celibate. So a big part of becoming celibate is training the frontal lobes. So already once we understand kind of the sequence of sexuality, we can see how if we knock out any one of these regions or interfere with any one of these regions, that it will actually like result in a decrease in sexual drive. Okay? So there are a couple of other things that we can talk a little bit about just to give you all examples. So there are also hormonal influences. So remember, a hormone is a chemical signal that travels through your blood to every part of your body. and coordinates your whole body in a particular mode. So low testosterone, high levels of prolactin, and then there are also things like high levels of serotonin. So serotonin is our satiety hormone. So when we're content, we have high levels of serotonin. And so as we become more and more content, we become less and less aroused. Okay? So there are other kind of global effects as well. Now let's get to the features of asexuality. So the first thing to understand about features of asexuality is that there's all kinds of like interesting stuff. So that doesn't mean anything. So let's get to what's interesting. So remember, we're talking about lack of interest. So now I'm gonna kind of go through various research. So there's one study that looked at vaginal plethysmography. So plethysmography is looking at sort of the physiologic response. Okay? And what they sort of found when we're watching erotic films is that people who are asexual, in this case it's vaginal, so we're looking at women, they have no interest mentally, but the body responds normally. So what this sort of means is that somehow stuff from the thalamus is somehow going, even though we're not aroused through like these circuits and these circuits, somehow the signals from the thalamus are ending up at the hypothalamus and activating the physiology. Does that make sense? So like even though these steps aren't really here, oh, I guess you guys can't see that. So even these steps aren't really here. Somehow when we're talking about asexual individuals, the sensory input ends up activating the physiology. Okay? A couple of other things we know. So asexual individuals actually masturbate a fair amount. But if you talk to people who masturbate and are asexual, they say it's more about relieving physical tension or inducing relaxation. So it is more common for asexual individuals to like kind of clean out the plumbing, as it were, and they're not necessarily horny. They sort of feel like emotionally not ideal, physically not ideal, so they kind of like, they use it almost like as a substance, right? So you just kind of masturbate and you feel better physiologically. So that stuff, the plumbing works with asexual individuals. They're just not interested in sex. So the other thing is, if you ask people, okay, so if you masturbate, like, what do you think about? So this is what's in the mind of asexual individuals. First of all, they can sometimes feel a vague sense of lust. But the lust is oftentimes not directed towards a person. So this can be kind of like confusing for people to understand if you haven't experienced it, and can become quite revelatory for people who do experience it. And I kind of feel like horny, but I'm not like into a particular person. So they sort of have this diffuse sense of attraction. So they kind of feel like sort of sexual, but there isn't an object of their sexuality. The other thing is that one researcher was sort of coined this term autocorasexual, which is essentially like identity less sexuality. So this is something that's very, very interesting. Sometimes people who are asexual will have fantasies, but the content of their fantasies is very interesting. So the first is that even in the case of a sexual fantasy, they do not identify with one of the characters. So for most human beings, when we have a sexual fantasy, we are the protagonist, right? So like if you feel like when you have a sexual fantasy, like there's a decent chance that you're like, I want to have sex with this person. Man, it would be great if I had sex with this person. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this. So we are the protagonist of our sexual fantasies. But people who are asexual can still imagine sexual things and even be somewhat aroused, but they're like not involved. It's kind of like an interesting experience, okay? So there's kind of like an identity less sexual experience, right? And also when I'm working with people who are exploring their sexuality, sometimes like even with like the men that I work with, more common with men for whatever reason, just based on my sample size and who I've seen, you know, even when we talk about what their sexual fantasies are, I'll sometimes ask them a very scary question, which is, in this sexual fantasy of, you know, man having sex with woman, which one do you want to be? And sometimes that's a very scary question for people because they can sort of imagine the fantasy and they're getting turned on. And there's two actors there, but which one actually turns you on? Do you want to do the railing or do you want to get railed? And so the way you identify with your sexual fantasies can be very, very informative about who you are and how you think and what you get turned on by. Okay? So we sort of know that this also is where, like, sometimes they'll have fantasies about fictional characters. Or they'll have romantic feelings towards fictional characters. Okay, this is also common. So this kind of relates once again to, like, either you're involved or you're not involved, or something is going on with identity and being the protagonist. We're not really sure. But in someone who is, like, let's say heterosexual or homosexual, we kind of know that, like, I'm involved. This is what turns me on. I want to do all the stuff. But even asexuals, when they masturbate, can fantasize about particular things, but they can fantasize about other people. It's just kind of what we know. Okay? Now, okay. So now let's talk a little bit about what we know about the biology of asexuality. Okay? So, we also have evidence that asexuality is a variant as opposed to a pathology, because there's all kinds of really interesting biological correlates. Okay? So we know that women who are asexual are more likely to have atypical menstruation. Okay? So we know that there's more likely, if you take 100 women who are asexual and 100 women who are not asexual, the asexual women are more likely to have irregular or atypical menstrual cycles. And so remember, this oftentimes has to do with estrogen and progesterone, but the female menstrual cycle probably affects a lot of other hormones as well. And so something about estrogen and progesterone are going to prime this whole system. So even progesterone reduces sexual desire. So when a woman gets pregnant and they start producing more progesterone, that will inhibit various parts of arousal and even like sexual desire, and not just sexual desire, but also sexual acts and things like that. So the other reason that prolactin inhibits sexual desire is probably from an evolutionary perspective. So when we're producing prolactin, if we're women, we're going to be prolactin, so it's like prolactation. So we're producing breast milk and stuff like that. And as we have high levels of prolactin, it also inhibits our ability to get pregnant and inhibits our things like our sexual desire. And that's probably like adaptive, right? So once we've just had a baby, we're not ready to get pregnant again. And once the baby is old enough to start eating food and stop breastfeeding and stuff like that, that's when they're old enough, they're kind of stable, and now we may be able to get pregnant again from a physiologic or evolutionary standpoint. Not just humans, by the way. This is true of animals as well, okay? So we know that there's atypical menstruation. We also know that there is a delayed onset of puberty. And this is where we got to talk about something else, another feature of asexuality. So one thing that's really interesting about asexuality is that one study showed that among adolescents who identify as asexual, if you measure them later in life, out of 25 who are asexual, only 3 will continue to identify as asexual. So we know that at least in one study, it showed that a fair amount of asexuality will resolve over time. And that's a little bit more fluid than we originally thought. So the key thing that I would say, and I'll sort of offer some conclusions towards the end, is if you're someone who feels like you're asexual, I would be careful about jumping into that label as a permanent part of your life, okay? Because there's some evidence that it does actually change. A couple of other things. This is really interesting. More likely to be non-right-handed. This is true of homosexuals as well. There's something about handedness and sexuality where, for whatever reason, there's something going on in the brain or whatever that people who are asexual are more likely to have a non-dominant right hand. So this can be left-handed or ambidextrous, which means that if you fight with two weapons, you get less of an attack penalty on your offhand. Okay? So it's like, awesome. Asexuals are better at dual wielding. You heard it here first. Chat lords. Okay? The other thing is that we also know that people who are born later in birth order are more likely to be asexual. So what does this mean? So if your mom had like 4 kids and you're the 4th kid, you're more likely to be asexual than the first kid. Now, there's some really interesting research behind this. This is also true of homosexuality. But there's a lot of stuff about the in utero environment that seems to affect sexuality. So this could have everything to do with like hormonal concentrations that change with subsequent pregnancies. But one really interesting hypothesis, or not I mean, there's some evidence of this, is that if you're a woman, you've got 2 X's, right? And so you have no Y chromosome. So when you have a male child in your uterus, the male child starts to produce proteins from the Y chromosome. And this is what allows the child to develop as a male. And in some women, what happens is we actually develop antibodies to these Y chromosomal proteins, which then changes, like, we don't know exactly what those antibodies do. Sometimes it attacks those things, sometimes it activates them. We're not quite sure what effect it is. But what we sort of know is as women have multiple kids and they develop these antibodies to proteins from the Y chromosome, it sort of affects the likelihood that their subsequent kids will be homosexual or asexual. So some people have posited that this is one of the mechanisms, okay? So we know that there's a lot of biology to asexuality. We're not quite sure like what this means or what's going on. This is where, once again, I kind of said we don't have very good studies on this. So we haven't really explored this fully, but we've got data points here and there that suggest that there's a biology to it. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about asexuality variants. Okay? So if you're someone who doesn't believe that asexuality is a real thing, hopefully I've given you some evidence that we can rule out everything else, right? We can rule out all the pathologies, and some people are asexual. Furthermore, we can look at the nature of sexual arousal, interest, and engagement, and we can see that if we tamper with any of this stuff, we will have difficulty with sex, right? And depending on what you tamper with, it'll have a different effect. But there are a lot of different things. So this is the other thing to understand about sex. It's not like a one organ thing. So if we look at our heart, right, our heart handles the heart stuff. The liver handles the liver stuff. Stomach handles the stomach stuff. Gallbladder handles the gallbladder stuff. But when it comes to sex, it requires a coordination of all of these different parts of our brain. So we can screw with one and we can get all kinds of changes. So for example, if we have a history of trauma, trauma will affect this and this. The inability to engage in empathy and even our emotional response to the sexual act. Right? So that's where trauma works. Whereas hormones, so hormonal changes, will affect here. And so we can look at all the different things that can lead to a lack of sexual interest. We can even see where they exist, like how they interfere with the sexual process. Now let's talk a little bit about all these variants of asexuality, okay? So I don't know these terms very well, okay? But like this is where when we look at asexuality, there's a variety of subjective experiences, okay? So one is like this process of being aromantic, gray A, or demisexual. I don't even know what these terms mean. I should have taken better notes. And so we sort of know is that they're variants of asexuality. So these are people who feel no degree of romance. I think demisexuals are people who, if they have a romantic connection, that can lead to an increase in sexual behavior or arousal. Okay. Yeah, and if y'all want to help me, you guys can define some of these terms for me. I have this. 1 second. I can find it. Left the paper behind somewhere. Okay. So there are various... yeah, so gray A, I think that's right. So you can sometimes experience sexual attraction. Okay? That's what gray A means. The point is that there's various variants. And we can kind of see, right? So let's take the case of a demisexual. So someone who requires an emotional connection. So if we were to look at this person, there's a decent chance that their sensory input, the strength of their sensory input is lower. So looking at like erotic pictures does not trigger a strong desire for sex. And instead what they need is a strong emotional connection or a strong sense of empathy. So these are people who, I'm hypothesizing here, right? There's no studies about this. And that if you look at this, the balance between sensory input and emotional importance when it comes to the desire for sex is altered in these individuals. Very simple. So that what I like about sort of understanding the core neuroscience is you can look at any one of these variants and we can understand how this can be explained by neuroscience. Okay? So we know that there are some variations, and like that's fine. Like we don't know too much about the science. It's not that we've studied, I haven't seen a ton of studies on gray A people or demisexual people. And the reason for that is because these terms, by the way, are like subjectively developed, right? So this is people in the asexual community will start to define themselves in these particular terms. These are not scientific terms. This may exist, this may not exist, we're not quite sure. So it's very possible that, for example, someone who's aromantic, that if we took all the people who are aromantic, we'd find a very high history of trauma. And so we don't know whether like it's people who are aromantic have a high history of trauma or it is a normal variant, right? So people who are gray A, who sometimes experience sexual attraction, we have no idea, is this a normal variant? Or is this consistent with hormonal fluctuations? Right? Because the whole point of gray is sometimes you feel sexually attracted, sometimes you don't. Well, Dr. K, I wonder what changes from day to day or week to week in someone's life. Oh, their hormones change. So maybe that's like the cause of being gray A. We just don't know. Because these are not scientific terms, these are community-defined terms. And now what we need to do as scientists, so we need to explore what the hell is going on here. Okay? Now, let's talk about a couple of other things. So, people on the autism spectrum are more likely to be asexual, are also more likely to be non-binary. Now, this is very interesting because we know something about the neuroscience of autism. So what we know about the neuroscience of autism is that these people have difficulty with empathy. And one of the reasons they have difficulty with empathy is that their internal signaling is off in some way. This doesn't mean that it's bad. So sometimes I think it's very clear that autism is, to me anyway, and I'm not intending to offend anyone, but so I've worked with patients, for example, who have severely autistic children, and I think of that as an impairment. So we're talking about kids who self-harm a lot, can't engage in dialogue, can't even learn things like urinary control, bowel control, can't engage in friendships, don't even communicate. And when I sort of look at that, I think of that as a medically defining that as an illness. I'm not saying that that person has less value or more value. There's also cases of high functioning autism where this doesn't, I mean, their lives are hard, but many of these people don't see that as an illness. And I think that's completely fair, right? So this is just who I am. I'm wired a little bit different from everybody else, and I'm not necessarily ill. So be it, right? So I can see both sides of that. I think it just depends. I mean, most of what I see is based on what my patients see. So if my patient says, yeah, I think of autism as a disadvantage, I'll say, okay, sure. And if another patient says, I think of autism as not a disadvantage, I say, okay, sure. You're the one who's autistic. You're the one who gets to decide whether it's a disadvantage or not a disadvantage. I have no place making that value judgment for you. So what we kind of know is that people with autism have difficulty with empathy. Their internal signaling, especially their emotional signaling, seems off. So this also creates difficulty with relationships. And we know that people on the autism spectrum are also more alexithymic, which means we are colorblind to our emotions. So I can tell that I vaguely kind of feel bad or good, but I can't tell that I'm feeling shame or guilt or whatever. So what we sort of know about autism spectrum and alexithymia is that there is a blindness to our internal processes, things like emotions. If there's blindness to our internal emotional processes, this makes it hard for us to be empathic, which in turn makes it hard for us to form relationships. Right? Does that kind of make sense? So if I don't have empathy, like I'm not where this other person is, and it gets confusing for me. So this also, I think, correlates with asexuality, because if we go back to the neuroscience of asexuality, we begin to see that these two circuits of the brain are very important for the whole process of sexual arousal. And so that this sort of idea of like lust and emotional engagement and connection is like very important for sex in general. So we can also see, like, once again, how people can be demisexual. Okay, this makes sense too. So we just know that something about these circuits is common amongst all three of these people, right? So if I'm asexual, here's how I'd put it. If I'm asexual and I have, let's say I'm alexithymic. So this means that this part is impaired and this part is impaired. If I'm alexithymic and I'm autistic, we can see how alexithymia leads to a inhibition or difficulty of having sex via alexithymia. So if I'm not aware of my internal signals, this is kind of why I also touched on the insula. There are various parts of our body that give information to our body and brain. So our brain and our body talk to itself. And so if I can't talk to myself, if I can't listen to myself, then it seems to interfere with sexuality. So we did a deep dive some time ago about transgender and asexuality, where we dug into this in a ton of detail. So our goal today is not to talk about asexuality and autism spectrum specifically. It's to talk about the umbrella of asexuality, and autism is a slice of that. If y'all want way more detail about that, definitely check out the transgender and asexuality video. Okay? All right. So now the question kind of becomes, what do? Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to y'all. Okay, so enough iPad. Time to just talk as humans talk. All right, so here's my take. First disclaimer is I'm not an expert in asexuality or LGBTQIA mental health or anything like that, okay? So I'm a clinician. So if you just do like general clinical medicine, which is what I really like. So I did a fair amount of addiction psychiatry, but I just saw basically anyone and everyone. And so here's kind of my take. And I have no desire to offend anyone. So if I say anything out of line, please let us know. It's honestly, I'm coming at this from just my understanding, and I'm sharing it, and I hope it'll be helpful to you. So the first thing is, if you're not attracted to someone or anyone, first of all, that's okay. The second thing to understand is that there is a differential diagnosis for asexuality. So one of the biggest mistakes that I think a lot of people are making nowadays is that they define themselves as asexual. Right? So if you lack sexual attraction by the age of 14 or 15, you say, I am asexual, and then you define yourself in this way. Now, I think if you're doing that, you're doing yourself a little bit of a disservice, because I think that you may not be asexual, right? So remember that some amount of asexuality resolves, or there could be a hormonal thing, or there could be some other kind of thing. You may have hypoactive sexual desire disorder. You may have there's all kinds of stuff. So if you lack sexual interest, I think the most important thing to do is to thoroughly explore it. This is the main piece of advice I would give, is just explore it. Now, I think this is a case where I would strongly recommend therapy over something like coaching, because I don't think that coaches on average are trained with this kind of stuff. Now, if a coach specializes in this, then that's a different story. Our coaches certainly don't specialize in this. They just have sort of this peer support angle. So we have coaches who I'm pretty sure we don't ask, right? But they've sort of volunteered some of this stuff. We certainly have coaches on the spectrum. We have coaches who are neurodivergent. We have coaches who have a range of LGBTQIA identifications. So that exists. But I would strongly recommend that you work with a therapist first. So we also know that psychotherapy is helpful for people who are asexual. So psychotherapy is helpful for a couple of reasons. One is that if you have something, if your asexuality distresses you, you should absolutely see a mental health professional. Because if you get distressed by this, then there are things that they can do to help you overcome that distress and even work on that arousal and engage in healthy sexual relationships. Even if you are not distressed by it, we also know that there are benefits of seeing a therapist. And that is because the worst challenge of asexuality is not just that you're asexual, it's the societal stigma against asexuality. So in terms of acceptance, managing that kind of stuff, therapy can be very helpful. So I'll give you all just a simple example. I've had patients who are asexual, and one of the most annoying things for them is how they talk to their family, because their family just doesn't get it. They're like, why aren't you seeing anyone yet? Like, oh my God, the big 30 is coming up and you're still not married. Like, oh my God, like you just have to say the word and I'm going to help you out. Like, oh my God, this is something you got to do. You got to do, you got to do, you got to do. Right? There's just no awareness that like you may not be interested in that. And then you have to deal with that crap over and over and over again. And you can say, I'm not interested. And then how are they going to interpret that? They're going to be like, what's wrong? Right? They don't understand that this can be a variant of the population that you're just never going to be interested. They think something's wrong with you. And then they go about trying to fix you if you're not interested. Right? And then sometimes like you'll even have people who are like they're very woke, right? Oh, like even though I'm Indian, I'm boomer and whatnot, I'm woke. I'm with it. I know you're not interested, but you're gay, right? It is gay. You're a gay. I know that. That's not, that's what I mean. Like people just don't get that asexuality is like a normal variant. So coping with that stuff, some of the social stigma of it, sometimes people don't know like how to relate to you, right? Like they don't know like what this means. Like, should I invite you to couple stuff or not couple stuff? Or like, it's hard to fit into this world if you're asexual. So therapy can help with that. Okay. So you can see a therapist. So explore it. Now, there may be some people, I was sort of preparing this lecture and I was kind of thinking there may be people who are offended if I say like, okay, don't lock in your asexuality, even if you feel asexual. And the reason for that, and I'm not placing a value judgment over like asexuality is like less than not being asexual. But I think that in general, in life, the right way to live life is to try to engage in the fullest range of experiences. So I think you should enjoy as much as life has to offer. Now, I'm not saying that you should enjoy, you need to do everything, so you don't have to do everything. That's not what life is about. But that if you choose not to do something, that's totally fine. So I think the right way to live life is to say, okay, if I don't ever want to try meat, I'm happy being vegetarian, so go for it. Right? But the vegetarianism is something that you should choose ideally as opposed to it being forced upon you. This is true of all aspects of life in general. I think life is better when you get to make a choice about how you live your life as opposed to being forced into something. And I've absolutely worked with people who believed they were asexual and will then discover that they are not asexual and that something or other is going on, whether it's a history of trauma. I've seen hormonal imbalances. I've worked with people, for example, that will have things like pituitary tumors that are secreting prolactin. So So it's a relatively benign tumor. It doesn't really mutate or metastasize or anything like that. A pituitary adenoma can sometimes secrete prolactin. So you've just got one thing, which is a high level of prolactin. And especially in something like men, that'll absolutely kill your sex drive, and you'll think that you're asexual because you have no sexual desire. And so then we sort of discover that this person has a pituitary adenoma through some blood tests. We do a CT scan, they surgically resect it, and suddenly they're horny for the first time in their life. Okay? So in my opinion, that this is like a good thing, right? Like, and you're allowed to tell me I'm wrong, and I'm going to be open-minded if you tell me I'm wrong. But I would encourage y'all, and I see this happening a lot with like young people nowadays, right? So now I'm showing my millennial age, that we too often define ourselves way too quickly. Right? We'll like pick some term and then this is what I am. And then now you're locked into this. No, you're not. If we know anything about the sort of history of sexuality, it's that sexuality is more fluid than we originally thought. So don't lock yourself into something. Give yourself the capacity to change. And by all means, assess all of this kind of stuff. If you have like a lack of sexual desire or whatnot, like go ahead and assess it. I've also seen the flip side, where men are like, oh, I have low testosterone, I have low testosterone, I have low testosterone, I'm not horny, I'm not horny, I'm not horny. It's not that you're not horny, you're just asexual. Your testosterone is fine, right? And they'll supplement testosterone anyway. And then maybe they have male hypoactive interest disorder. Also a possibility, because it's ego dystonic in that case. But I've seen the whole range. So the main thing that I would encourage y'all to do is like just understand this stuff, even understand yourself a little bit more, and then by all means explore. Don't lock yourself in. Okay? Sexuality is a choice? I don't really think so. So I think we've got, there's a certain amount of choice to it for sure, but we also know that there's a certain amount of wiring, right? So with all this like data about, let's say, the antibodies to the Y chromosomal proteins, like I don't think that's a choice. But that clearly seems to have a statistical correlation with asexuality or homosexuality. Okay? Yeah, so could you... okay, so now let's do... So questions. Could you discuss the distinction between desire for sex and desire for romance? Yeah, absolutely. So sex, generally speaking, is a mechanical act, right? Is a physical need. So like you don't have to have, like romance is about an emotional connection or even like playing into a cultural narrative. So romance is about like narrative and emotion, and it can or does not need to include sex. So I'll give you a simple example. You can watch as many rom-coms as you want to. Very few of them will include sex, right? Maybe at the end or maybe at the very beginning. But generally speaking, most romantic stories have a minimum of sex. And on the flip side, you have a lot of people who are like into hookup culture and stuff like that, which is sex without romance. So sex is a physical act. Romance is a narrative, an identity, an emotional experience. And the two are absolutely linked, as we've seen based on the neuroscience. Okay. Is sex really a need, or is it just something that people strongly desire? It's a great question. So let's think about what's the difference between a need and a desire. So when I think about a need, I think about something like food, clothing, shelter, like things that are necessary for survival. Now, I don't think sex is necessary for survival because we've had a lot of human beings who have never had sex in their life and they died just like everybody else. There's even some anthropological kind of like quite woo-woo evidence that asexuality is helpful for the survival at the level of family. So I'll kind of put it this way. This also relates to something called like the gay uncle or gay aunt hypothesis. So let's say back thousands of years ago when human beings were like evolving in that world, right? So let's take two scenarios. Let's say that there's scenario number one where there's a family of five, where you have 5 kids, and family number 2 also has 5 kids. So you have 2 sets of 5 kids. Now in family number 1, all 5 kids have children, and let's say they each have 5 kids. So now you have 10 adults taking care of 25 kids. And in family number 2, let's say four of us have children. So we have 20 kids and one person never has children. So now we have arguably 9 adults taking care of 20 children, or 10 adults taking care of 25 children, or even the single person may be partnered in some way, or the asexual person or homosexual person may be partnered in some way. Then you've got 10 adults taking care of 20 children. And so what is the survival likelihood of that next generation if one of the people from the generation above never has children? And there's some hypothesis that having more, like a certain ratio of adults to children that they take care of, and having some adults without their own kids will benefit the survival of all of their nieces and nephews. So in that way, sexuality a need? I wouldn't really call it a need, but I would say that for the average person, it is generally speaking, a healthy part of a full life. But there are many exceptions to that. Right? So if you're taking the average person, I would say that having a healthy sexual relationship is one of the core parts of life. And by the way, I didn't talk much about spirituality. If you guys are curious about that, we can sort of take a spiritual perspective to asexuality and things like that. But that's like completely unscientific. So I'm trying to do this, today's lecture is based in science and clinical experience. Okay. All right. So you guys so there's some voluntary asexuality. Okay. Let me think for a second. So drop me stuff and say, did you miss the schizoid part? No. So the other thing is that people who have a schizoid personality are more likely to be asexual. So there's a very strong correlation there as well. Okay. I don't know what automatism is, Josan. Do you think schizoid PD can be treated? Probably. But it's I don't know if I've ever had, if I've seen people with schizoid personality disorder, it's been like less than 5 patients, and I haven't had a long clinical relationship with them. So it's one of the things that I don't speak much about because I just don't have the clinical experience. Yeah, so someone's saying aromanticism exists outside of asexuality. It is correlated pretty highly, but not exclusive. Aromantic and allosexual as an identity exists. Yeah, absolutely. So, we sort of see that, but I think that's a conversation for a different day, right? So I think the lack of romantic attraction that we see prevalently today, so people are into hookup culture and even like red pillars or things like that. I think there's a lot of stuff going on there psychologically. So that I have a ton of clinical experience in. So what makes it hard for people to form romantic connections? That's a whole different, I don't know if you guys remember this. I could draw you all a chart that is along the lines of this very easily for romanticism. We can do this, and we can point out all the ways that people can become not into romantic. Okay, so you guys want spirituality, fine. Let me just make sure that there aren't other questions about this. So dissociative personality disorder. So we will have something about that soon. Give us a couple months. It's in the works. Okay. What is SPD? Oh, schizoid personality. Is it mostly ego dystonic or not? It's ego syntonic. We've got Vapu Art in chat who's saying, as someone who's schizoid, it's not a problem for me. So that's a big difference. So most people with schizoid personality disorder, it's quite ego syntonic. Okay, does anyone physically cringe at the idea of romantic gestures, but on the very rare occasion crave physical affection or physical touch? I feel mostly embarrassed, cringe away from romantic gestures and physical touch, but on the rare occasion I want it. Is that aromantic? So this is a prime example of why we're kind of talking about this. This does not sound aromantic to me. So one of the key things, I'm not diagnosing you, and aromantic isn't a diagnosis, but let's understand this example, okay? So a key feature of asexuality as a sexual variant is egosyntonic. Egosyntonic means you don't have a problem with it. You're actually fine with it. So even if we look at the psychological impacts of being asexual, most of the psychological impacts are not from being asexual. They're from other people treating you a particular way because you're asexual. It has nothing to do with you. You're fine with it, usually. Now, if you physically cringe, that speaks to me that you have some kind of response to this, which is aversive. Now, that clearly has a differential diagnosis. So like when I've worked with people with a history of trauma, this is sometimes what it sounds like, right? So even I had that growing up. So when I first started like dating and becoming intimate with partners, I found that I had a very like physical revulsion and discomfort with like touch because it just didn't feel right. And it took me a little while to like get used to and appreciate that. I had to sort of calm down my physiologic response, my embarrassment. I had a lot of problems with like PDA and things like that. But all that stuff is gone now. Now I love it all, right? So I'm very like touchy-feely with my kids, and I love hugging them and picking them up and throwing them up in the air and things like that. So that stuff I think can change. That's why I'm saying sort of don't define yourself as aromantic if you have those kinds of things. So there's a difference between having nothing. Okay, so here's the key thing about aromantic versus not aromantic. There's a difference between not feeling any romance and longing for something and having a different part of you that is like cringing away from it. So aromantic is not internal conflict. Aromantic is an absence of romantic desire. So if you're the kind of person who has internal conflict where I want it, but I think it's cringe, that's internal conflict. That can be resolved, usually. Right? That's my experience. So ambivalence or internal conflict is very different. That's not asexuality. So people who are asexual usually have no desire whatsoever. Usually something else is at play when you have that intrinsic sexual desire, but some other part of your brain is like pulling you away from it, is warning you, is having this physiologic response that I've seen a ton of times with trauma. So just to give you all a simple example. So I was once working with a woman who had something called vaginismus. So vaginismus is spasm of the vaginal muscles, usually the outer vaginal muscles, like the vaginal entry point. So if you have a muscle spasm at the entrance of your vagina, they're spasming, and any kind of penetrative sex will be incredibly painful because it can even trigger the spasm. And so this person feels lust and is sexually attracted and can even be in love, but anytime they have a sexual penetrative experience, it hurts like hell. And they tried using lubrication, they tried doing this, they think they're in the mood. And then what happens is your body starts to seize up because it knows, oh shit, even though you want to have sex, you can't have sex. And then your body is like, this is going to hurt. So even as you start to have sex, your body is like, this is painful, by the way, this is going to hurt. And then you start to fight against yourself. And then your arousal disappears because now you're being triggered with your trauma for penetration. And then you force yourself into it because you want this, you want this, you want this. And then it hurts again and again and again. So thankfully there are treatments for vaginismus. And so this is a case of having a sexual desire, but then you at some point, your brain learning this is not a good idea. But you can thankfully do that unlearning. So there's a big difference between asexuality and conflicted sexuality. Okay. Right, so this is the key thing. If you have some kind of reaction, then the likelihood of asexuality or aromanticism is, I would say, lower, right? Because the whole point is we define it as a lack of interest. It's not a negative reaction. You can form negative reactions if you lack interest and you kind of give it a shot and it's like, fuck that, that wasn't any fun. You try it again, you're like, fuck that. Then you can form a negative reaction. What types of therapies are best for massaging out aversive responses to intimacy, touch, desire? Ooh, that's a good question. The short answer is it depends. And we also are going to be working on that. So we'll have some stuff on that shortly in a couple months. In January, I am doing another secret project. And then we're going to cover all this kind of stuff there. Man, there's so many questions about trauma. Okay. But you guys want spirituality, right? Can someone's sexual orientation be ego dystonic? Absolutely, man. Oh man, have I seen my fair amount of that. So like the good example of this is like homophobic homosexuals. There's a ton of that. So it's well studied. So we know that there's this thing called reaction formation. So if I'm conditioned in a way that I'm taught, let's say that I'm taught that homosexuality is bad, evil, okay? I'm not going to even use the word sin. I don't even want to single out a particular religion. For whatever reason, I'm taught that homosexuality is bad. And I grow up in a situation where homosexuality is viewed as bad. So as I start to have homosexual feelings, I feel homosexual and homosexuality is bad, therefore I am bad. And then it's very hard to go through life hating a part of yourself. What's way easier is for us to take that hate towards ourselves and project it towards somebody else. And you'll notice this is true for many people, everyone basically. The things that you hate the most in other people are the things that you hate about yourself. I fucking hate that I'm always late. And do you have compassion for other people when they're late? No, screw these people. I hate that these people are late. This is what makes us all hypocrites, right? So if you like talk to most of your friends are hypocrites, you're a hypocrite. And so that we do this, we have this very simple trick that we do that when I hate myself, because I can't fix it, right? It's who I am. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to prove to myself that I'm like, this thing is bad and I can punish other gay people. And the more that I punish other gay people, the more it aligns with my conditioning and I just sort of don't have to worry about the fact that I'm gay. So it's very common. Okay. No. Okay, so so let's talk about spirituality. All right, what am I going to say? Let me think about how to. Okay, so let's talk about. I know we're talking about sexual attraction and interest here, but we're going to kind of start with sort of an Eastern perspective, okay? So first thing is we did a whole video on this about how being virgin is the ultimate Chad. And we talked about this concept of brahmacharya, which is sort of a spiritual practice that enhances your spiritual potency. So we're just going to touch on issues of sex, sexuality, and even to a certain degree of gender identity. So this is from my perspective, okay? So when I say like Eastern religions or Hinduism or Buddhism, that doesn't speak for all of Hinduism or Buddhism, but generally speaking, I think it's a fair statement to make and many scholars will agree. So if you look at the East, their perception of the self is that there is a transcendent self that has no qualities. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but if you look at like who you are, your sense of identity is based on certain mental patterns. Okay, so when you say, I am smart, so I can't dissect you and find smartness anywhere. I can't biopsy you or x-ray you or find smartness anywhere. Where? Your IQ, you may say, but I have a high IQ. That's why I'm smart. No, even if you have objectively a high IQ, there's a big difference between having an IQ and feeling like you're a smart person. If you have a high IQ with a bunch of normal IQ kids, you will feel like you're smart. If you have a high IQ and you're surrounded by a bunch of geniuses, you'll feel like you're stupid, even though objectively you have the high IQ. So the first thing to understand is anything that you believe about yourself is a mental construction or abstraction. And this is why it's very easy for identities to change. I used to be a loser, now I'm a winner. I used to be a beta, now I'm an alpha. Now I'm a sigma. I used to be a student, now I'm a doctor. I used to be a son, now I'm a father. Right? So identity is fluctuant. And sure that there are real things in the world that change, but my point is that that real thing doesn't determine the identity. The identity is an abstraction of the mind. So there are many people out there in the world, this is sad, just to give you all an example, but once you become a dad, doesn't that make you a father? If only that were true. The number of people that have come into my office who have biological dads, but no fathers is astronomical. See, having a child doesn't make you a father, right? So as we see, the first thing to understand is there's a difference, and there's also people who have no biological children and are wonderful fathers. So being a father is not the same as having a child, right? Like, it's kind of weird, like biologically. So there's the outside world, and the outside world penetrates into your mind, and your mind forms conclusions about it, and that conclusion becomes your identity. And since it's not a real thing, it's very easy to change, right? That's why your identity changes over the course of your life. There's a lot of research on this too. You can look at the research on post-traumatic growth and narrative and identity formation and letting go of your ego and all this kind of crap is there, okay? But this is the first thing to understand. So then the question is, okay, like, what are you? If all of your identity is essentially a mental construction or an abstraction, which absolutely has utility in the real world, right? So when I think of myself as a doctor, that helps me function in the real world. Other people think of me as a doctor. I think of myself as a doctor. Patients come into my office. I do the doctoring. They receive the doctoring, and then we're done. So it's very useful. That's why it's that way. But if you really look at the truth of it, all of your identity is false. And I'll give you all just another example of this. So like gender identity is a good example of this. So even gender identity is false. Really, if you look at the chorus form of yoga, you say that gender is also an abstraction. But you can say, but Dr. K, I have a penis. Doesn't that make me a man? I'm not trying to get into the gender debate. We're not going to touch that. Let's just look at it medically. So what makes a woman? Well, a woman is someone who has the capacity to have children. Okay, fine. So let's say that there's a 9-year-old girl who's in a car accident, has a hysterectomy, we remove her uterus. Does this mean that she's no longer a woman or a girl? Because she can no longer have children, right? So this is something that I've worked with a lot with my patients. So like a woman has the BRCA gene and has to get a double mastectomy. Every woman I've ever worked with who has a double mastectomy then goes through a crisis of being a woman. You don't feel like a woman because what is a woman? A woman has tits. And now I no longer have tits. Therefore, I'm not a woman. And then everyone will turn around and say, no, but you are a woman, believe, blah, 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 blah. But for that person, there's absolutely a trauma because this sense of what it means to be a woman, part of like my identity of being a woman is that I will wear certain tops and it makes me feel very like powerful and sexual and people give me attention. And now I have these scars, right? So like very simple things. Like a patient who has a mastectomy is like, do I still wear a top when I go to the beach? Or am I supposed to be shirtless? Like, I don't even fucking know. There's nothing to cover up. It's all gone, right? Very traumatic, very difficult. So you can take whatever physical feature that you want, and the idea of being a man and a woman is a mental construction, according to the yogic system. I'm not trying to go down the road of woke or not woke or whatever, okay? I'm staying away from that. I'm just talking about, let's just think about it, okay? So next thing to understand is that, so this transcendent self, like if you kind of close your eyes and like, let's say we take a kid and then we like, the kid grows up by itself or raised by aliens on a planet where it's like needs are taken care of and stuff like that. What kind of gender identity would the kid have? Like, it's not clear, right? We don't know. So if we really look at a lot of our conceptions of masculinity and femininity, like there's not part of the transcendent self. So the transcendent self, so if you close your eyes and you meditate and you just exist for that moment, there's no masculinity or femininity. You're just existing. You're just observing the breath. It's you and the breath. That's all your experience is. And then we can extrapolate that out a little bit and recognize that every moment is just what the moment is. And our sense of identity is something that we stitch together from all of these different moments, but it's still stitched together. So this is where we get to the first kind of Eastern aspect, which is Ardhanarishwar. So there's an incarnation of Shiva. Let me see if I can find this for y'all. So in the East, we have this concept of Ardhanarishwar. So this is an incarnation of Shiva. Oh, God. Who is both half man and half woman. So Shiva and Shakti are like two sides of the same coin. They're yin and yang. We have all these like different kinds of entities, right? So this is Ardhanarishwar, like this side's a dude, this side's a woman. And there's different kinds of like meditative practices and stuff to connect with this kind of Ardhanarishwar. I'm not qualified to teach all those practices because I haven't really done them. I mean, I understand it in some way, but I haven't been trained in that stuff, so I can't teach it, unfortunately. Now, this has to do with gender identity, but gender identity is not sexuality. So let's talk about sexuality. Okay? Next thing to understand is like, all right, so when it comes to spirituality, like what is lust? Right? So this is where we sort of stop and think about it, and lust is just a desire. It's a desire to engage in some kind of act. And what we know is that when we engage in lustful behavior, just like we looked at the neuroscience, it reinforces the nucleus accumbens. We form associations. Our brain gets wired, right? Oh, this shit is good. And then once our nucleus accumbens want something, we spend our days wanting this particular thing because it feels good. So yogis will even say that sex is the most fundamental of addictions. And that if we really want to be like, have a fully pure mind and we want to be free from our desires, it's very hard to do so while having sex because sex will make us want to have sex again. Now, this is the weird thing. So see, a lot of people in life are seeking freedom. But what they're really seeking is freedom to engage in bondage. And what do I mean by that? So if I talk to people and ask them, what do you want in life? They're like, I want a ton of money. I want a ton of bitches. I want a ton of hoes. I want whatever. A ton of dudes, whatever. Right? So I don't want any worldly responsibilities. And what are you going to do with your freedom? I'm going to eat whatever I want to. I'm going to drink whatever I want to. I'm going to travel where I want to. I'm going to fuck whoever I want to. This is what I want in life. Okay? This is what everybody wants. But what fundamentally people do not understand is what is running your life at that point. You're not running your life. Your desires are running that life. You are just giving free rein to your internal impulses. So if I ask a 5-year-old child, what do you want? I want to eat cookies for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then I say to the child, okay, fine, here's cookies. You can have as many as you want for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Is this kid going to win the game of life? This is what they want. They want endless accessibility to their desires. But what they're actually doing is they're being bound. They're the least free in life because they don't control what they do. They're just giving in to their desires. Now the nucleus accumbens is running the show. Right? And some of y'all will say this person has won the game of life. They haven't. Right? And you can see this. If you look at people like on social media and things like that, you'll see a lot of people who claim that they've won the game of life. And even we'll look at them and we'll say, oh my God, this person has so much money. They have so much fame. They have so much power. Everybody wants to fuck them. This is the life that I want. Very few of those people are actually happy, in my experience. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they can say, yeah, I'm the happiest person. They think they're happy. Fine. Maybe I'm wrong. But what you'll oftentimes find is that these people are unsatisfied. They're not content. They have all their desires fulfilled, but they're not content. And believe me, I've seen it so many times. I've worked with trust fund babies who have all the money in the world and can hire as many sexual people as they want, and they're still unhappy. Because that's not where happiness comes from. And even y'all will understand this because you know what it's like to have a nucleus accumbens that's running your life. Pornography addiction, technology addiction, video game addiction, social media addiction. Nucleus accumbens is running your life, running your life, running your life, running your life. So asexuality, like as I've grown older and as I've engaged in more and more spiritual practice, I become more and more asexual. And this is a good thing. So I still like, I've got kids and stuff and I'm married and whatnot, but like to be less lustful is good. But I also enjoy lust too. Like, don't get me wrong. It depends on what I'm doing. So if I'm doing a lot of spiritual practice, my lust will go down. If Kruti is listening to this, she's like, stop fucking lying. Because I can also be quite the lusty pirate, if you will. All right, but this is the key thing to understand, is that as you engage in so this is where the spirituality comes in. So the key thing is that if we want to understand our transcendent self, if we want to kind of engage in like these advanced spiritual practices, you cannot be lustful, because the lust is a distraction. There's also a physiology to the lust because it wants it, right? So this is where you'll look at things. So for example, there's this yogasana called Siddhasana, which is a depths pose. So I'll show you all Siddhasana. Okay. So in Siddhasana, the main thing is that, this is probably the best one, the heel of one foot is placed in the perineum. So the area between the scrotum and the anus. And let's look at this. So if we look at the scrotal blood supply, let's see. Let me try to find the right. Okay, I don't know if I can, I don't know if that's going to get me banned actually. So I don't know. So if you look at the scrotal blood supply, the blood supply to the scrotum actually is in the same spot that you press in Siddhasana. So in Siddhasana, you press your heel against your perineum. And when you sit in that posture for a long period of time, you're gently compressing the blood flow to the scrotum. So you start to probably, this is my guess, I don't have studies showing this, but just matching up what I understand from physiology to something like yogic practice. The reason that this is called a depths pose, this is what you sit in before lotus posture, by the way. So you sit in a depths pose, not lotus posture. And the reason for that is because it slowly decreases the blood flow to your testes, which I'm guessing means that you will sort of start to produce less amount of testosterone. And then as you produce less testosterone, your lust decreases and you can focus in meditation. So the cultivation of asexuality, or what we call brahmacharya, is a very important goal in meditation. There's also some really weird stuff about when you nut, you sort of lose all of this shakti or energy. So if we look at the human being has a capacity to make a new life. And this energy is very powerful because it can literally make new life. And the moment you start losing it through things like masturbation or sexual activity, you lose a lot of your spiritual potency. So a big part of this is the key thing to understand, is that as science has become as meditation has become more and more scientific, we've actually lost 99% of the spiritual potency of these practices. So there's something weird going on in meditation right now, which is that more and more people are meditating, but very few people are having spiritual experiences from meditation. And then what science concludes is that all the spiritual stuff is false. But the reason that no one is having these spiritual experiences is because no one's body is primed for the spiritual experience. So a good example of this is and so if you talk to some of these gurus and stuff, they'll use all these terms like energy and dormancy and stuff like that. They'll say your spiritual energy is dormant. So the machinery is there, but you need to engage in a particular kind of diet. You need to have a particular hormonal balance. And once you have all of these kind of diet and balance, your gut microbiome needs to be low inflammatory. Even your insulin level needs to be super low, which is why we sort of eat these very specific yogic diets. Once your physiology has all of these things going on, then your brain can trigger a spiritual experience. Now, this is also to be understood that psychedelics, so no substance that you eat or drink or ingest can create something new. All the substances can do is trigger endogenous receptors. Okay, so for example, let's say I use marijuana. There's a cannabinoid. But the whole reason that we get high off of marijuana is because we have cannabinoid receptors in the brain. Why do people enjoy alcohol? Well, because alcohol binds to the GABA receptor. right? So the receptors already exist. We just have an external substance that's triggering them. Why are opiates so effective? Because we have mu receptors, right? So we have to have the endogenous structure for a substance to trigger. The only problem is that this stuff cannot be triggered unless you do all of the other stuff with meditation. That's the important stuff. And then you engage in the spiritual practice and you'll have some kind of weird experience. So the whole point of asexuality when it comes to spirituality is to engage in this kind of stuff. And technically, brahmacharya does not mean celibacy. Brahmacharya means non-lustfulness. So you can nut, you can even have sex, you just can't be horny. That's the goal of brahmacharya. And as you become more brahmachari, the potency of your spiritual practice will absolutely increase. You just have to try it. You'll see. If you eat a sattvic diet, if you eat the yogic diet, you do all these practices, and you free from all substances, and then you abstain from sex to the point of becoming naturally non-lustful, then you will undoubtedly have a spiritual experience. But it's not enough to not have sex. This is where the no-fap people get it wrong. Because they don't ever sublimate the desire. They just try to control the jerking off. Okay? So asexuality is very potent. It's a very potent spiritual force. This isn't just the Eastern tradition. If you look at, there's another really simple historical example. If something is true, multiple cultures will discover it. And what you find is that every culture and every religion, every spiritual tradition, I don't know about every, but all the dominant ones that we know about all have an asexual track that they correlate with spirituality. And there's even stuff that shows that a lot of the weirdness of sexuality and sexual identity even comes from like this part of the brain called the temporoparietal junction. And that a lot of these like weird spiritual experiences that we trigger, including things like depersonalization, have something to do with the temporoparietal junction. So sex affects the temporoparietal junction. People who are very, very religious have a sort of a temporal lobe hyperactivity. And people who dissociate and depersonalize have activity across the temporoparietal junction. And when you have these meditative experiences, they're like derealization and depersonalization. There's something going on in that part of the brain. The science is really not there to say that all of these things is really what it is. We just sort of have some vague inclinations that there are 2 or 3 different things that all relate to that part of the brain. Okay? And so sexuality and spirituality are very tied together. And so there would even say, okay, but what if I'm asexual? What does that mean for my spiritual practice? So if you ask a yogi, what do you think about me being asexual? They would say that asexuality is, you're lucky to be asexual. Asexuality is a consequence of your brahmacharya from a past life, your celibate, your spiritual practice from a past life, so that you could be born in this life and not have to worry about lustfulness. See, think about this. Asexuality is a beautiful gift on the spiritual path, because there's the rest of us who struggle with lust and struggle with nofap and struggle with porn. And now you are born with a life where you have porn resistance, sex resistance, lust resistance. And so now you can devote yourself to spirituality without getting bogged down in all that stupid shit that ruins everybody else's life. From a spiritual perspective, asexuality is one of the best traits to be born with. Because you look at everybody else's life. What fucks up the most people's lives? Lust. Number 1 problem is lust. What causes the most damage in the world? It's not anger. It's not sadness. It's not suicidality. It's lust. Why is this? What do you mean? But isn't lust the source of love? Yeah, that's the fucking problem. Because when you were growing up, you had a parent who lusted. And so then they had sex with someone besides your other parent. And now there's a divorce. Now there's 2 sets of kids. And now the parenting is all fucked up. And now that you're divorced, You know, your parent decides to marry this other person that they got pregnant, and now they want y'all to be one happy family, but you didn't pick that. You don't want to be one happy family. This is lust. You're at work. You have a secretary. You lust for the secretary. Sexual harassment, sexual predation. Here we go. Sexual exploitation. Here we go. Lust. And even for all those disasters, forget about all those disasters. You're a fucking teenager. What causes the most hurt to teenagers? Lust. I'm lusting for this person, they're not lusting back. It's the foundation of a whole genre of books, right? These are fiction romance novels. What's fictional about it? This is a fiction novel. What's fictional? The fiction is that you lust for someone and they lust for you. If it was nonfiction, it'd be I lust for them and they lust for somebody else. Easy. Y'all get this? So if you guys want the based take, it's that if you're asexual, engage in spiritual practice because you have plus 100% yields on spirituality. You already are born with what the rest of us are struggling with. Consider yourself lucky. And go see a therapist because the rest of the world is going to hate you for it. People are talking about Twitch, right? Like, so let's just talk about the meta changes for a second. So everyone's blaming Twitch. Coomer meta, right? But like, y'all understand the problem that Twitch has? The problem that Twitch has is fucking Twitch chat. How on earth do you expect a platform to regulate the coomers of the internet? Like, what the fuck, man? Like, I'm not saying that their policies shouldn't be better, but like, do you guys see like the basic, like, how the fuck are you supposed to come up with some policy when there's just a legion of coomers that are just waiting for any crack? It's like a single crack in the dam and it's a flood of the coomers. Here we go. Right? It's like, hold on a second. There's a ton of people who are choosing to watch this stuff instead of watching video games. And I'm not saying that there isn't like some impressionable young kid who isn't a coomer yet, who sees all this crap on the front page and then they suddenly watch it. But like, let's like bear in mind what the real problem is. Right? The Twitch is a platform where there's plenty of people who are willing to make nude content, and there's plenty of people who are willing to watch it. I have something to sell, you're interested in buying it, and we're blaming the guy whose stall I'm sitting in to conduct my business. Right? I'm not saying that they should or shouldn't do something. I have no idea what they should or shouldn't do. All I'm pointing out is that there's like another layer to this. Okay? And I don't know, I just don't see anyone talking about that. Yeah, right? So people are saying that's what OnlyFans is for. And yeah, I mean... Luke Romick is saying, Dr. K, please go topless and get into the hot tub, join the meta. Yeah, I would. We'll start an OnlyFans one day. But everyone's too concerned we're too commercial to begin with. Okay. So does that make sense from a spirituality standpoint? I know there's not like, I mean, there's a lot of potency to a lack of lustfulness. Sexy gamer when? Oh, Serb egg. Oh, sweet child. We are already sexy gamer, and if you can't see it, that makes me sad. Okay. Any last questions? See, everyone's saying, isn't it a problem of sexualizing? Okay, so here's the thing. Let me explain something to y'all. Everyone's saying, oh my God, they're sexualizing content. Anyone who watches this is going to get sexualized. You're right. It's a problem. But boy, are we screwed if we are relying on a platform to regulate what happens to us. The only true antidote to you being sexualized by the internet is you. The whole reason we got here in the first place is because we put the responsibility of mental health on the platforms. Like, look at social media and attention spans and the rise of ADHD. And we sat there and we were like, yeah, like, oh my God, like now, like my attention span sucks because I spend all this time on TikTok. Man, fuck TikTok. Like, we surrendered our power in this relationship. We surrendered the ability to like decide what I want to do with my fucking head. And one of the big reasons for that is because here I am with an army of one in my head. And then what am I up against? I'm up against billion-dollar industries that are trying to take advantage of my brain. So no wonder we're losing. Because we're outgunned. But the moment that you rely on someone else to shape your mind in the right way is the moment that you lose control of your life. Think about what you're doing. I've seen this in relationships where like I'm waiting for this person to make me feel good about myself. It's so sad, especially with parents. I want my parent to love me. I want my parent to love me. I want my parent to love me. My sense of self-worth depends on my parent. And this is hard, right? I'm not blaming this person, but there's some amount of agency because that's how we're wired. So that everyone's exploiting our wiring, that's fine. But like, bros, ladies, everything in between, you have some control here. Right? You have some control. What you put into your mind is your choice. You have some choice. Oh, I can't resist it. I know you can't resist it on a given day. Fine, you crack. I cracked yesterday. I ate Taco Bell. I ate Taco Bell at Christmas time. And then, boy, did I regret it. I may be done with that now. Can't meditate after Taco Bell. It's really terrible. Like, I just felt so heavy. Like, just mind is just dull and doesn't focus and all this other kind of crap. 2 veggie Mexican pizzas is my go-to order. All right? So this is where, like, train your mind. If you train your mind, you will have full control over your life. So if you look at, like, why do people not accomplish what they want in life? It's because they can't get this thing to listen. This thing doesn't listen. I want to do the dishes, but this guy doesn't want to. So fuck it. I really should fill out that job application, but this guy doesn't want to. So fuck it. And we wonder why mental health is getting worse. Reason mental health is getting worse is because what little training we had for the mind, we've now outsourced. Ooh, interesting question. Do spiritual experiences breed more spiritual experiences the same way that lust breeds more lust? Basically, yes. Not precisely, but basically, yes. So let's understand something about spiritual experiences. As you start to have spiritual experiences, you accumulate Shakti, energy. That energy will then facilitate further spiritual experiences. That's number one. Number two is that just like anything else in the mind, if you condition the mind in a particular habit, then it will get conditioned in that way. So after you have a spiritual experience, you may be more excited to meditate. Right? So then you sit down to meditate more often. It becomes more important to you. Totally fine. There are some ways in which spiritual experiences can cause problems in terms of having other spiritual experiences. So there are a couple of pitfalls. So here are the pitfalls of spiritual experience. Number one is when you have a spiritual experience, it creates an expectation to have another spiritual experience. And having an expectation prevents the spiritual experience from happening. Because the first one you had no expectation because it had never happened to you before. Right? So the first time you have like an out-of-body experience, you're like, wow, this is insane. But how did you get to that first spiritual experience? With a lack of expectation. I was just sitting there observing my breath, and suddenly this weird crap started to happen. Now you go in and you have the thought, I want to float around. Let's go. Let's astral travel. Let's go do all this stuff. And that will prevent you from attaining it. That's number one. Second problem, pitfall with spiritual experience, is that it feeds our ego. Because now this thing has happened. Look at me. I'm so spiritual. I'm so spiritual. Oh my God. So cool. So the simplest way to avoid the pitfall of spiritual achievement is by shutting the fuck up. Do not talk to anyone about it. The moment that you talk about it, it becomes externalized. See, here it is living within you. And if you talk about something, it goes out into the world and it leaves you. This is why psychotherapy works. Oh, I have all this trauma in here and I talk about it. Now it's not in here anymore. It's out into the world. We did a great video about why people who are quiet are really advantaged in life. And you'll notice that there are people who talk a big game and never do anything. And there are people who actually do a lot who usually don't talk about it. So the more you store your energy in here, the more it compounds. This is what we know from trauma. So if I put something in here and I never let it out, it compounds and it starts to rot away on the inside because it's a negative thing. And so what happens is as you start to talk about it, your ego grows. You move away from the conditions that allowed you to have that spiritual experience. And you also lose that Shakti. Does that make sense? So spiritual experience can foster more spiritual experience provided you don't do it, you don't screw it up. So the best analogy I can give is, hey, if I make money, does it get easier to make more money? Yeah, usually. Right? So if you've gotten to the point where you're making a fair amount of money, all you have to do is keep doing that and you'll get more money. And furthermore, there's a certain compounding interest. If you can save some, that money will grow on its own. So that's same is true of spirituality. But that's only true if you don't spend it. Right? If I get my first paycheck, I'm like, look at me, I got so much money, and I'm going to go buy a bunch of shit, then I won't make money. So Synapse is saying, how is being quiet and compounding negativity good? Compounding negativity isn't good. We want to vent our negativity. The whole point about being quiet is you want to compound your positivity. Don't talk to people about your positivity. Right? When you achieve something, just let it go. Don't go tell the whole world, hey, I'm doing this. Hey, I'm working on this project. Hey, I'm working on this. I have this idea for an app. Let me tell you all this cool stuff I'm going to do. So even we sort of subtly do this. So today we said, hey, I've got a super secret project coming up. So we kind of put a nod to it. I'm trying to signal to the people that, hey, their answer's coming. I'm working on it. And at the same time, I'm not going to talk to y'all about what I'm doing. Because the moment I talk to you, it creates expectations. I lose my energy for it. All kinds of stuff. Check out our video on introverts being advantaged. So Ayakashi Twins is saying, hold everything inside. Don't hold everything inside. Let the negative stuff out. Vent the negativity. Whatever you want to compound is what you should hold inside. Do you personally believe in determinism? I don't know what determinism is. I believe in karma. And karma is nothing but the principle of cause and effect. Why not hold the positivity inside? Why not share it? It depends on whether you want to compound the positivity or not. Right? So when I earn something, let's say I earn money. Same answer as money. Let's say I earn $100. Why not share the wealth? You can absolutely share the wealth, but then it'll be gone. It's not a bad thing to share the wealth. The question is, what do you want? So if you want to share, if your goal is to make the world a better place, then by all means share your positivity. All right? You want to make this person happy because they love you and want to share something, go for it. But there's very slippery. See, the mind is slippery. The reason I'm speaking in absolutes is because it's very easy for ego to hijack wanting to make the world a better place. Very, very sneaky. So what about love? If your love doesn't show, how can you truly love? What a great question. So what we're talking about is speaking, not doing. So I never said don't do. So if you have some positivity in there, you want to share it through your actions, egoless action, go for it. Share it, right? If you feel proud of something, or if you've accomplished something and you want to share it with the world, do it, but do it without ego. So if you want to, if someone needs money, you don't advertise that you're a charitable person. That's a problem because other people will come to you asking for money. Right? So you can do kindness. I'm not saying don't do kindness. What I'm talking about is specifically about spiritual culmination and the cultivation of spiritual energy. So there are gurus like Sadhguru speaking about their spiritual experiences. Why do they do it? Don't they lose energy? Based on my understanding, they do. But that's also I don't know. You'd have to ask him, right? Why he shares what he shares. I mean, I have some inkling, but I'm not going to comment on that because generally speaking, we don't do that either. So on this channel, we do our best to talk to people, not talk about people. Doesn't mean that we sometimes talk about people, but we try to be present and just not talk about people. So if you want to know why someone's doing something, you go ask them. Okay. How can you tell if it's actually egoless or just virtue signaling? So that comes with the power of discrimination, right? So the more you become aware of what ego looks like and how it acts, the more you'll be able to tell. Is this for ego or not for ego? And then the other subtlety here is you can do something not for ego and still have your ego affected. So my personal experience has been that I can do something from a place of no ego, but what I've come to realize is when I do it, the ego will grow. So I just prepare myself for that. And I'm doing this thing, it's not ideal, the ego will grow, but so be it. Because sometimes you have to communicate for some other reason. So just to give you all a simple example, right? So I trained at Harvard Medical School. And that's a good thing, right? It's like, oh, are bapre. And there are times where I will share that. So like there are times where it's useful. So like I also wrote a book. And as part of the book proposal, and when I'm speaking to my agent or a publisher, I want to share that tidbit because it will make the venture that I'm trying to do more successful. And I pay the price of now my ego is going to grow a little bit because I've said, look at me, I'm so great. All right, so there are times where you have to do it. And that's okay. It's just the price you pay is going to be a growth of ego. And since I choose to exist in the world, this is going to happen. My ego is going to come. Which, by the way, y'all can pre-order now. Right? So it's a parenting book. For those of y'all that don't know, I wrote a book about how to be a healthy gamer, and people may be super confused about that. Why didn't you write a book for us? A very simple reason. I was looking at, if I die tomorrow, how can I help the world? And what I realized is that if I had written this book, or someone else had written this book 30 years ago, half of us would not be in the position we're in today. The most important thing I can do is go back in time and teach parents about how to communicate with their kids and how to protect them against technology. I'm helping 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and 7-year-olds, hopefully, fight against this tide of addictive technology. Right? Very simple. Now, I wish I could say that you guys can benefit a lot from the book. I think you can benefit a lot from the book, but like it's not, I mean, the target is parents. So if you guys want to understand the psychology and neuroscience of gaming, we explain all of that. And if you want to get better at your communication skills, then you'll benefit from the book. But like 30% of the book is going to be framed towards people that are not you. But now we also have the average age in our community is like in the early 30s, I think. So we have a lot of young parents. And if y'all are a young parent, definitely check it out. It certainly helps us and then makes it easier for us to write additional books if this book is successful. Because then we can say, okay, if Dr. K has a choice between streaming for 50 hours and writing a book, what's a better use of my time? There's absolutely like a very like materialistic calculation to that. It's not just money. It's about reach and trying to help the most people. There's a worldly calculation. So I would certainly appreciate it if you guys want the book and you're interested, go for it. We also teach a fair amount of like communication skills, which I think people in our community have been asking for. Once again, it's framed from like a parent-child perspective, but how to talk, how to listen, how to set boundaries with people. If y'all are interested in that stuff, definitely check it out. So that's what we did it for. And I next ones are coming for y'all. I don't think I'm going to write another parenting book. That's the one thing I did for them, and they can go have that, and hopefully we'll make the world a better place. Next stuff is going to be for y'all. Okay? All right, so thank y'all very much for coming today. Let's see. Not me. So I think it's also interesting, right? Because if we ask about parents, what we'll find is that if we have a stream on asexuality, there's a selection bias there, right? Oh my God, I've never seen this one before. It's a cool emote. So stream on asexuality, I would imagine that the majority of people aren't parents, but hey, you never know. So listen, I just want to say thank you all very much for being with us for 2023. We started this journey 4 years ago. It's been a lot of fun. I think it's cool that like I'm working today and this is what I do for work. I'm grateful to be able to do this, share this stuff for y'all. We really hope it's helpful. I'm really lucky that I get to do things that help y'all and I enjoy. And I'm grateful for y'all for supporting us in whatever way you have. And supporting us in terms of just showing up and watching and participating, asking questions. That really makes our content way better. So thank you for that. Whether it's subscribing or following or whatever, that helps us too. And if y'all do stuff like you sub or you donate or like order something or buy the guide or whatever, like all that kind of stuff helps too. We're here to try to build as much as we can for y'all. Unfortunately, a silly lesson that I learned a little while ago is that the more free stuff you build, the more expensive it is, which I don't know why I didn't think about. And so as we've grown and stuff like that, we've started to realize we do need some kind of income. And so we're trying to build things for different people based on what their resources are. And we try to sort of make things as value driven as possible. So that's another reason why we don't do a whole lot of like donation drives and stuff like that. I really want y'all to be able to get some value. If you're giving us money, we want you to be able to get some value out of it. And for those of y'all that are kind enough to just give us money just because you give it to us, thank you very much. We'll put that money to good use in building things like this. So thank y'all very much. Have a happy, happy holiday. And I'll see y'all probably in 2024. Tiny little chance that I show up on New Year's Eve or something like that and I just stream because